All right, I'm going to talk about a few traps that students fall into while writing the open argument essay. These are things that are tempting, and I see them a lot in high school writing, but they don't really actually help your case. In fact, they usually hurt it. First, don't define things that most people already know the definitions of. As I talked about in the topics of invention, if you need to define something, make sure you're doing it to further your argument, not just explain something people already know. So especially avoid dictionary definitions, but in general, you just don't need to explain something that most people know, and you're just using the definition that most people know. You need to define things when it's gray, fuzzy, nuanced, complicated definition that you need to say, hey, let's be on the same page here and know what this thing is, so then I can build my argument off of that. Next, avoid making broad generalizations about things you don't know much about. These are commonly things that kids sounds condescending, but students talk about that they've clearly mostly just learned about from like TV shows, or they've been told some sort of stereotypical ideas about them. So, for example, um, crime, drugs, and prison. Students will say, people who do crime, as if there's one kind of crime and one kind of person that does crime. Sure, that's how people talk in Batman, but that's not how it works in real life. Drugs, as if there's one kind of drug and all people who do them are the same, and they're all the same bad, and they all do the same effects to the body, and it's just not how drugs work. Um, be much more specific. Define, put parameters, put qualifiers on it. Next up, prison. I see students sometimes will just talk about prison as this like thing that they think they know about. Like, this is what prison is, and it works, and it's like this, and it's not actually that simple. Prisons are pretty horrible places in America. They're overpopulated. There's prison abuse. Not everyone there probably should be there. Some of them are private. People make profit off of it. It's more complicated than just there's prison and they work like TV. Students sometimes limit themselves to historical evidence. Um, Instead, use contemporary evidence as much as you can. The problem with historical evidence alone is you're not putting it in context of the society we live in now, and you end up oversimplifying it and limiting it to what you learned in history class, but only the parts you remember. And so it's like one or two little tidbits. Instead, put history in context of today and how are they similar, how are they different, do some of that comparison to help you have some context. Otherwise, your essay is going to read like a list of random dates and things without real arguments. Avoid the most obvious and cliche evidence. If it's easy to access and it just pops into your head and you don't know much to say about it, it seems simple, probably not going to make your case. Don't assume other people's lives are similar to yours. You are not the default person. In fact, you are probably the exception. You're in an AP class at Egan High School. There's fewer people in a class like this than there are not in America. So be aware of the fact that your experience does not represent everyone. Be careful of cliche generalizations like throughout human history, society nowadays, today's society. You don't really mean that, do you? Like all of human history? If that's true, you better be like really meaning all of human history. Or society nowadays makes you sound like, I don't know, one of your grandparents. What's nowadays? Is it today? Is it the last 2 weeks? You're only 16 or 17 years old. What's the previous days? Same thing with today's society. Define your time period. Which society are you talking about? Don't assume the audience has read the prompt. Don't call it a prompt. Don't say in response to the prompt. Give yourself some context so somebody reading this will have no problem understanding what you're saying, as if they've just picked this up like it's somebody sends them an article and opinion section of a publication. They're like, hey, you should check this out. They read it and they're like, cool, I get it. Put the language from the prompt in the beginning of your essay so it flows naturally to say, freedom is something we ask for. However, really all we want is safety, as Mencken explains, or then give the full name, and blah, 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 blah. Next, be really careful about using extremely heavy pieces of evidence without giving them the weight they deserve. Um, COVID and the Holocaust and racism and wars are not a like tidbit to throw in. I so often see students sort of feel like, for example, the Holocaust, and then it's like two sentences and they move on. If you're going to talk about the worst parts of humanity, like just the worst things that could possibly exist on Earth to the human experience, you got to give them the weight they deserve. If you have a paragraph about how you didn't get on the basketball team and then a paragraph about the Holocaust, even if you're not consciously comparing them, if the paragraphs are the same length and the same style and the same weight, you're essentially comparing them. So be aware of the weight of the evidence. Not all evidence is equal. Don't cherry pick evidence. Don't just pick examples that prove your point and then leave the obvious counterpoints on the table. Then it just sounds like you're filtering life through a very limited lens and your argument's not very strong. And then lastly, and maybe the most important on this whole list, many of you right now are talking about various political issues or a divided society with various impacts without identifying what those are. You got to be able to identify what those issues are. If you can't talk about specific political issues, you got no argument. You got no point. Because what you're doing then is you're acting as if you're somehow outside of it, and all political issues are the same, and they're all equal, and they're all divided in the same way, and that's just not how life is. So you really got to own the specific issues. Additionally, this comment here, divided society. A lot of you are talking about how our society today is so divided. First of all, that makes it sound like you are somehow outside of it and like above that, and you're probably not. And second of all, you have to be able to talk about what that is. We are not two sports teams in America just arguing about who's better. There are many, many more shades of gray. Like I mentioned before, you could have, I know you can, a room full of people who all voted for Joe Biden just argue with each other for hours and hours and hours and hours. How you voted in this past election is not the dividing line in the sand of two sides of society. And they're not equal sides, right? Like, you know, people who are arguing about ideas are often debating whether or not someone exists as a human being and deserves rights, or they're arguing about who's more important or what our priorities should be, and or two people arguing about gay rights and neither one of them is gay. Like those people are arguing about someone else's life. That's not a divided society. That's two people arguing about someone else, or a wealthy person arguing with another wealthy person about how we take care of the poor people in society. That's not just a division of two teams, right? That's two people in power arguing about someone who's not there and their life. Like division is more complicated than just two sides. So please, please, please be specific and don't generalize that stuff because you end up sounding kind of sort of ignorant when you talk about those things. Hopefully these are some helpful tips of some things that I am seeing as traps.